The moment Manny Pacquiao heard what had happened to his daughter at school, his world seemed to stop. The boxing legend had faced countless challengers in the ring, but nothing prepared him for the message he received that afternoon. His 12-year-old daughter Queenie had been humiliated in front of her entire class. The culprit wasn't a bully from the playground, but someone meant to guide and protect her, her teacher. Miss Reynolds, a veteran English teacher at Westridge Private Academy, had mocked Queenie's accent in the middle of a lesson. She labeled her just another poor Filipino trying to fit in, and even added that she would never amount to anything no matter who her father was. The classroom fell silent. Some students laughed nervously, others looked away, but all eyes were on Queenie. Her cheeks burned as she fought to hold back tears. For Queenie, it was the most humiliating moment of her young life. She had been at the school for only 3 months. Despite being the daughter of a world-famous athlete and senator, she never flaunted her background. She wanted to be judged on her own merits, her intelligence, her kindness, and her hard work. She excelled in math and science, often staying late to tutor classmates. Many teachers admired her dedication, but not Miss Reynolds. The English teacher had a reputation for being strict, but behind her stern persona lay deep prejudice. She came from privilege, and she looked down on students she felt didn't belong in elite schools. To her, Queenie's accent was a flaw, not a sign of bilingual strength. That day, she decided to break a child's spirit in front of 25 classmates. When the bell finally rang, Queenie rushed to the restroom, her hands shaking. The tears she had been holding back poured out. She thought of calling her parents, but hesitated. Her father had important Senate duties and her mother was busy with charity work. Why burden them? But as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, her father's words echoed in her mind. Respect is earned, but disrespect should never be ignored. Wiping her tears, Queenie picked up her phone and sent a short message. "Dad, can we talk after school? Something happened." Manny Pacquiao was in the middle of an important meeting when his phone buzzed. He rarely checked messages during official duties, but something made him glance at the screen. It was from Queenie. Only 6 words. "Dad, can we talk after school?" A father knows when something is wrong. He excused himself politely, telling his aides the session could continue without him. For the rest of the drive to the school, his mind replayed possibilities. Was she hurt? Bullied? Sick? Nothing prepared him for the trembling voice he heard when Queenie finally climbed into his car. Through tears, she explained everything, how Miss Reynolds had mocked her accent, dismissed her abilities, and dragged her identity into the dirt. Manny listened in silence, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the wheel. Inside, a storm raged. He had fought some of the toughest men alive, but hearing how a grown adult had tried to crush his little girl cut deeper than any punch he had ever taken. Yet he didn't explode in anger. He reached over, squeezed Queenie's hand, and said, calmly, "Don't worry, Anak. We will handle this together." When they arrived at the school, whispers spread quickly. Manny Pacquiao was walking down the hallway, not as the world champion or senator, but as a father with a purpose. Students peered from classroom doors. Teachers fell silent. The principal, Mr. Harris, rushed out of his office to greet him, smiling nervously. "Mr. Pacquiao, what a surprise." Manny cut him off with a quiet but firm tone. "I'm here for my daughter." Inside the principal's office, Queenie sat beside her father, her eyes still red from crying. Mr. Harris tried to smooth things over. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Miss Reynolds is a respected teacher. Perhaps your daughter took her words the wrong way." For the first time, Manny's calm broke. He leaned forward, his voice low but steady, the kind that carries the weight of both discipline and pain. "Are you saying my daughter imagined being laughed at by her classmates? That she misheard her teacher's insults? Respect is the foundation of education. If children are made to feel worthless, then what are we teaching them?" The principal shifted uncomfortably. He promised to look into the matter, but Manny wasn't satisfied. He asked to meet Miss Reynolds directly. When she entered the room, her face was stiff, her chin raised as if she were the one being wronged. She started defensively. "I was only trying to correct her pronunciation. Students these days are too sensitive." Manny looked at her, not with anger, but with disappointment so sharp it pierced deeper than rage. "Correction is not humiliation. Guidance is not mockery. You don't lift a child by breaking her spirit. If my daughter's accent offends you, then perhaps it is not her education that needs improving." The room went silent. Even the principal had no words. Then Manny stood, his decision clear. "I am requesting an immediate investigation. Until then, this teacher should not be in a classroom, and this school must do more than apologize. It must change. Because my daughter is not the only one who has been treated this way." Mr. Harris stammered, "Change? What do you mean?" Manny leaned on the desk, his eyes unwavering. "I will personally fund a cultural respect and anti-bullying program here. Every teacher, every student will learn that differences are not weaknesses. No child should feel ashamed of where they come from. If this school wants to be truly great, it must teach respect above all." The principal was speechless. Miss Reynolds, her face pale, had no response. For the first time in her career, someone had held her accountable in a way she couldn't dismiss. Queenie looked up at her father, a tear rolling down her cheek. But this time, it wasn't from humiliation. It was from pride. The days that followed were tense. News spread quickly through the school community that Manny Pacquiao had confronted the administration. Some parents whispered in support, grateful that someone of influence had spoken up. Others worried that the school's reputation would suffer. But what mattered most was that the truth was finally being acknowledged. The very next morning, Principal Harris announced that Miss Reynolds would be placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. It was a shock to many. Teachers in elite schools were rarely challenged, let alone disciplined. For Queenie, it was both a relief and a lesson. Justice, though not always immediate, was possible when courage met conviction. Manny didn't stop there. True to his word, he began drafting a proposal for a cultural respect and anti-bullying program. His vision was simple yet powerful: to create a school environment where diversity was celebrated, not mocked, where teachers were trained to guide with empathy, not superiority, where every student felt seen and valued. At first, the administration resisted. They argued that the school already had policies in place, that one incident did not justify an overhaul. Manny listened patiently, then responded with quiet force. "Policies written on paper mean nothing if they don't protect children in real life. My daughter's tears are proof that your system has failed. I am offering not only financial support but my commitment to making sure this never happens again. Not to Queenie, not to anyone." His words carried a weight no one in the room could deny. The board finally agreed. With Manny's funding, the school launched workshops, invited cultural sensitivity trainers, and introduced new reporting systems for students who felt mistreated. The change was not instant, but it was visible. Students who once laughed at differences began to learn about them. Teachers who had never questioned their biases were now forced to reflect. And slowly, a new culture of respect began to take root. For Queenie, the transformation was personal as well. At the first school assembly after the reforms, she was invited to speak. Nervous but determined, she stood before hundreds of students and teachers. Her voice trembled at first, but soon grew strong. "I used to feel ashamed of my accent," she said. "I thought it made me less smart, less capable. But I've learned that an accent is not a weakness. It is proof that you can speak more than one language, that you carry the richness of another culture. No one should be made to feel small because of who they are or where they come from." The auditorium erupted in applause. Even the principal, who once tried to dismiss her pain, stood and clapped. For the first time, Queenie felt not only seen, but respected. As for Miss Reynolds, she quietly resigned a few weeks later. She left without fanfare, her once intimidating authority replaced by silence. Though her departure was controversial among a few loyal supporters, most agreed it was the right outcome. A teacher who could not respect her students had no place shaping their futures. Looking back, Manny could have chosen a different path. He could have stormed into the classroom, confronted the teacher with anger, and demanded immediate revenge. But instead, he chose dignity. He chose to turn his daughter's pain into a catalyst for change, and that decision became the real victory. Because true strength isn't measured by fists in a boxing ring or titles in politics. It's measured by the courage to stand up for those who cannot defend themselves, and the wisdom to turn injustice into transformation. In the end, Queenie's humiliation did not define her. Her resilience and her father's unwavering support did. Together they reminded an entire community that respect is not optional. It is the foundation of every classroom, every relationship, every society. So the next time you hear someone mocked for their accent, their background, or their differences, remember this story. Remember that silence only empowers the bully, but courage, spoken calmly, acted upon firmly, can change everything. And now I want to ask you, what would you have done in Manny Pacquiao's place? Would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have stood up and demanded change? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice matters too. Months passed, and what began as a painful humiliation for a 12-year-old girl had transformed into a story of empowerment. But the impact of Manny Pacquiao's response reached far beyond the walls of Westridge Private Academy. News outlets soon picked up the story. Headlines read, "World Champion Defends Daughter Against School Humiliation," and "Manny Pacquiao Turns Pain into Reform." Social media buzzed with debates. Some praised his calm and dignified approach, while others argued he had used his influence unfairly. But one thing was undeniable. The conversation about respect in schools had been ignited on a national level. Parents across the country began to share their own stories of children facing prejudice. Teachers were reminded that their words carried power to either uplift or destroy. And students who once suffered in silence now had a voice. Manny had not only defended his daughter, he had created a movement. At Westridge, the Cultural Respect Program became a model for other institutions. Teachers attended empathy workshops, students were encouraged to celebrate their cultural heritage, and new peer support groups formed. For the first time, Queenie didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like a pioneer. Her classmates, who once giggled at her accent, began asking her about her Filipino background, about the language she spoke at home, about the food, the traditions, the music. What was once a source of shame turned into a source of pride. Queenie found herself becoming a bridge between worlds, helping her peers see that differences were not barriers but opportunities to learn. One afternoon, after giving a short talk at a cultural event, a younger student approached her shyly. "Queenie, I'm from another country too. I always try to hide it. But after hearing you, I think I don't need to hide anymore." Those words struck her harder than any insult ever had. She realized her pain had not been wasted. It had inspired others. Meanwhile, Manny reflected quietly on the journey. Sitting at home with his family, he admitted to his wife, "I wanted to storm into that school and shout. But if I had, maybe the teacher would have been fired and that's it. Instead, we changed the entire system. Maybe that is the bigger fight." His wife smiled. "You fought with wisdom instead of fists. That's harder to do, but it lasts longer." The true lesson wasn't just about standing up to injustice, it was about how you stand up. Manny's legacy as a boxer was built on power, speed, and endurance. But his legacy as a father and leader was now built on patience, dignity, and change. And Queenie? She carried the lesson forward. In class, whenever she saw another student being teased or excluded, she remembered the strength her father had shown. She learned to raise her voice, not with anger but with courage. By the end of the year, Westridge Private Academy had become almost unrecognizable. The toxic whispers and cruel jokes faded. The walls were decorated with flags from different nations, student projects celebrated diversity, and teachers began every new term with a pledge of respect. The transformation was not perfect, but it was real. As Manny watched Queenie step onto the stage at the year-end assembly to receive an award for leadership, he felt a swell of pride. Not for the medal, not for the applause, but for the strength she had found within herself. The same little girl who once cried in the restroom now stood tall in front of hundreds, her voice steady, her heart unshaken, and Manny knew this was the greatest victory of all, because titles fade, belts gather dust, and fame is temporary. But the lesson of dignity, respect, and courage, that lasts forever. The incident at Westridge Private Academy could have ended with one teacher's suspension. But instead, it became the spark for something much larger. Within weeks, word of Manny Pacquiao's initiative spread far beyond the school. Education blogs, parent groups, and even government forums began discussing what many had ignored for years: the silent wounds caused by bias and discrimination in classrooms. For years, countless children had suffered in silence. Students from immigrant families, children with accents, or those from less wealthy homes often carried invisible burdens. Many parents, unsure how to fight back, stayed quiet. But Manny's calm yet firm response gave them a blueprint. He had shown that one voice, backed by dignity and persistence, could create lasting change. Soon, parents across the city began demanding similar programs in their children's schools. If Westridge can do it, why not here? Became the rallying cry. Local media covered the growing movement. Talk shows invited education experts to discuss cultural sensitivity, and Manny himself was asked to speak at a national education summit. He declined the spotlight at first, insisting the focus should remain on the children. But eventually, he agreed because he knew his voice could push the cause further. At the summit, Manny stood at the podium not as a boxer, not as a senator, but simply as a father. He spoke softly, but his words carried weight. Respect is not a privilege, it is a right. Every child deserves to walk into a classroom feeling valued, not belittled. If we want to build leaders, innovators, and peacemakers, it starts here, in our schools. The audience erupted in applause. Some even stood moved by his sincerity. What was meant to be a local reform was quickly gaining traction at the national level. Meanwhile, at Westridge, Queenie continued to blossom. She became a mentor for younger students, especially those who struggled to fit in. Her own experience gave her a rare kind of empathy. She no longer saw herself as just Manny Pacquiao's daughter. She was a voice for others who felt small. One touching moment came when a group of international students asked Queenie to help them start a cultural club. "We want a safe place to share our traditions," they said. Together they created monthly events where students showcased their food, music, and customs. What began as a response to pain had evolved into a celebration of diversity, but the ripple effect didn't stop there. Neighboring schools began calling Westridge for guidance. Within a year, over a dozen schools in the district had adopted similar initiatives. Teachers who once rolled their eyes at the concept of sensitivity training began to see its impact firsthand. Classrooms grew more welcoming, students felt safer, and bullying reports decreased. National newspapers soon published editorials praising the Pacquiao Cultural Respect Initiative. Lawmakers debated whether similar programs should be introduced countrywide. For once, education reform wasn't about test scores or funding. It was about humanity. Manny, reflecting on it all, often told reporters the same thing. "This isn't about me. It's about every child who has ever been told they don't belong." My daughter's story is just one example. There are millions more, and they deserve better. For Queenie, the lesson was even more personal. She realized that strength isn't about hiding your differences. It's about embracing them. What once made her a target had now made her a leader. And as she walked through the halls of her school, she did so with her head held high, no longer weighed down by shame, but lifted by purpose. The day Miss Reynolds mocked her accent, Queenie felt powerless. But now she understood something profound. Sometimes the worst moments in life open the door to the greatest change. And as father and daughter sat together one evening looking back on everything that had happened, Manny smiled and said, "You see, Anak, life will always throw punches. But real champions don't just fight back, they change the fight itself." It was a truth Manny had lived his whole life. And now, his daughter carried it forward into a new generation. Years later, long after the headlines had faded and the world had moved on to new stories, Queenie Pacquiao stood at a podium of her own. No longer a timid 12-year-old hiding in a restroom, she was now a confident young woman, invited to speak at an international education conference. The hall was filled with leaders, teachers, and activists from around the globe. They had gathered to discuss the future of inclusive education, and Queenie had been chosen as the keynote speaker. She adjusted the microphone, glanced at her parents in the front row, and smiled. "This journey," she began, her voice steady, "started with humiliation. I was shamed in front of my classmates for my accent, for something that was part of who I am. That day, I felt powerless. But what I didn't realize was that it would become the moment that defined my future." The audience leaned in, silent as she spoke. Queenie described the day her teacher mocked her, the tears in the restroom, and the simple message she sent her father. She shared how Manny Pacquiao's response turned a moment of pain into a movement for respect. But most importantly, she explained how it shaped her own calling. "I learned that our voices matter," she said. "Even when we feel small, even when we think no one is listening. And I learned from my father that real strength isn't about fighting back, it's about creating change that outlives you." The applause was thunderous, but for Queenie, the real reward was seeing students in the audience, teenagers, young leaders, some with accents just like hers, nodding with tears in their eyes. By this time, the Pacquiao Cultural Respect Initiative had grown far beyond Westridge Academy. It had been adopted by hundreds of schools across the Philippines, the US, and beyond. Entire curriculums had shifted. Teachers received training not just in academics, but in empathy and inclusion. Generations of students were now walking into classrooms where their identities were celebrated, not mocked. And Queenie? She had become one of the leading voices in education reform. She studied psychology and international relations, combining her academic work with her personal story. Everywhere she went, she reminded audiences that a single cruel moment in a classroom could wound a child for life, or if handled correctly, could spark reform that benefits thousands. Manny, watching from the sidelines, often reflected on the lesson he himself had learned. That day at Westridge, his first instinct had been anger. He could have confronted the teacher, demanded her dismissal, and left it at that. But he realized something greater. His daughter didn't just need him to defend her, she needed him to model integrity. And that choice changed everything. Now, years later, he was no longer just remembered as the 8-division world champion. He was remembered as the father who turned his daughter's humiliation into a worldwide movement. One evening after the conference, Queenie and Manny sat together at home. The cameras were gone, the applause had quieted, and it was just father and daughter again. "Dad," Queenie said softly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come that day? If you hadn't listened?" Manny smiled, his eyes full of pride. "No," he said, "because I always would have come. That's what fathers do. And Anak, it wasn't me who changed the world, it was you. You took what happened and turned it into something bigger than both of us." For a moment, they sat in silence, both reflecting on how far they had come. From a cruel remark in a classroom to a movement reshaping education across nations. It was a journey no one could have predicted. And as Queenie looked ahead, she knew this was just the beginning. Her father had taught her to fight with dignity, and now she carried that lesson into every stage of her life. Because sometimes the battles that define us don't take place in the ring. They take place in classrooms, in boardrooms, in the quiet moments when someone decides whether to speak up or stay silent. And Queenie Pacquiao had made her choice. She would never stay silent again. Years later, when people looked back on Manny Pacquiao's career, many remembered the championships, the knockouts, and the glory nights under the lights. But for those who truly knew his story, his proudest victory didn't happen in the boxing ring. It happened in a quiet classroom, through the courage of his daughter and the calm determination of a father who chose grace over rage. The incident at Westridge Academy became more than just a story about bullying. It grew into a reminder that leadership isn't about titles, fame, or money. It's about how you use your influence when someone vulnerable is mistreated. Manny could have walked away after securing justice for Queenie. He could have considered the matter settled. But instead, he planted seeds of change that grew into something far larger than himself. For Queenie, that moment had been both painful and transformative. At 12, she had been forced to face cruelty that no child should ever endure. But through it, she discovered her voice. She realized that her accent wasn't a weakness. It was part of her identity, her strength, and her story. And years later, as she stood on stages around the world inspiring others, she carried that memory like a torch. Even Ms. Reynolds, the teacher who had sparked the incident, became a symbol, not just of failure, but of accountability. Her career never fully recovered. Schools were reluctant to hire someone with her record, and while some might have seen that as punishment, Manny never sought revenge. Instead, he often said in interviews, "This was never about destroying someone's life. It was about making sure no other child would go through what my daughter did." The world took note. Articles were written. Educational leaders studied the case. Parent groups used it as an example when pushing for reforms. The Pacquiao Cultural Respect Initiative became a model across multiple countries. But what moved people most wasn't the policy. It was the humanity behind it. In the end, this wasn't just Manny Pacquiao's story. It was every parent's story, every child's story. Anyone who had ever been mocked for how they spoke, where they came from, or what they looked like could see themselves in Queenie. And so, the story lives on, not as a scandal, not as a headline, but as a reminder of what true strength looks like. Strength isn't found in anger or revenge. It's found in choosing dignity, respect, and courage when the world expects otherwise. For Manny, it was another fight. But this time, there were no gloves, no roaring crowd, no championship belt waiting at the end. The prize was something far greater, the dignity of his daughter, and the hope that millions of children after her would never feel the same humiliation she once did. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all.